Welcome to the final class in this module, which is the Who Directs the How. Identity determines method. This class, it's not about improving your strategy, it is about examining your authority. In the previous teachings, we established that identity determines output and motive determines pursuit. Today, we examine the space between motive and outcome, which is your method, because you do not just choose actions, you choose how you act. And the how of your life is not neutral. It reveals who you believe is responsible for the results. We have established a flow throughout this module, these different classes. The last two being that the who leads the what, identity determines output, and the who owns the why, identity determines motivation. And now we're moving into the who directs the how, identity determines method. Before you keep going, if you haven't watched the previous classes in the module, I really recommend that you do so, because it's the only way for this class to fully make sense, is that you understand everything that has come before it. So that, because you understand that this is linked to a case that is being made based on a structure, on an established flow, that makes it clear that if your who is not established from the right source, if it's not received from God, then the why will be distorted. And if the why is distorted, then the how cannot be aligned. So you kind of have to understand why that is for this class to make sense. And so if you haven't watched the other classes, wherever you're watching this from, I have posted the previous classes. So I recommend taking a look at those and then continuing on. How sits between motive and outcome. It's the bridge between what you intend and what you produce. But it's not just a bridge of action, it's a bridge of trust. If the who is the source and the why is the demand created by that source, then the how reveals what you trust to meet that demand. If the bridge is compromised, the fruit will be compromised. You may have good intentions, you may pursue meaningful outcomes, but if the method is corrupted, the formation will be distorted. The how determines what your pursuit builds in you. Most people evaluate success by outcomes, but God evaluates by process. We live in a culture obsessed with what works, but heaven is concerned with how it was done, because how it was done reveals who you are and whose you are. Your method represents your trust. Your method represents your allegiance, and your method reveals authority, who you believe is responsible for the outcome. And because of that, we really have to take a closer look at what the how really is and how it fits in the established flow and the structure that we've been discussing in this module. We're going to start out in section 1 by defining the how more clearly, because it's not just tactics or strategy or how you get things done. It is far more than what most of us have been taught. The how is the method, the mechanism, and the proof of who is directing the process. It's a lot of new terminology, so let's break it down. The method is the way you choose to act. It is your approach. It does include the tactics, the way that you do things. It's how you move, how you respond, and how you engage. It answers the question, how am I doing this? Or how am I going to do this? The mechanism is what is driving that method, as the internal system behind it. Your beliefs, your fears, your motivation, your sense of responsibility. It answers the question, why am I doing it the way that I'm doing it? What is driving how I'm doing it? The proof is what becomes visible as a result. It is the evidence of who is actually directing the process. Not what you say you believe, but what the method reveals. It answers the question, Who is really in charge here? Most people think they can separate who they are, what they do, and how they do it. But you can't, because the how is where identity becomes visible in motion. You don't just act, you act a certain way. You don't just respond, you respond from somewhere, from a source. And that way is not random. It is being shaped in real time by who is directing the process. That's why the how matters so much, and it is so much more than what we've been taught, because it's not just what you do, it is how authority is being expressed through what you do. Your how reveals whether you are striving on your own self effort or your surrender to God, whether you're carrying the weight of your life or you're trusting God with it, whether you're forcing things to happen or you're following God. And it's not occasional, it's constant. The how is the operating system of your daily life. The how operates across three layers, and I'm going to speak to these layers through a structure that you've already been taught. So first you have internally through your being, then in how you produce, and then in how it expresses itself through your doing. In your being, your how shows up in how you manage yourself, your pace, your energy, your response under pressure. In your producing, your how shows up in how you operate, your strategy, your decision, your problem solving, your process. This is where the method becomes clear. In your doing, your how shows up and how it expresses itself through you, your tone, how you handle conflict, your leadership, your habits, your behaviors, right? So, this is where authority becomes visible to others. Across all three layers, the same question is being answered. Who is directing the process? Yeah. This slide should really start to look familiar now, and we do need to get back to the structure and the sequence that we've been building throughout this module. We just defined the how as the method, the mechanism, and the proof of who is directing the process. So the question is, where does the how sit within the sequence? There are two sequences at work that come from two different governing systems. The kingdom system that generates the properly ordered flow that starts with a God source identity. Who, why, how, what, fruit. Identity is established first, and everything flows from the who. The who determines your desires and motives, and your why determines what you pursue. The how is the bridge between motive and outcome. It is the method that carries your pursuit forward. So, whatever is driving your why will shape your how, and your how will determine the nature of your what. When properly ordered, the method is clean, the process is aligned, and the fruit is not forced, it is produced. Now, we have to contrast that to the counterfeit sequence from the worldly system that creates a self-derived who. It's either why and what, then the how, and then the who, your identity. So sometimes it begins with an insecure motive, other times it begins with a desired outcome, but it never begins with identity. And because of that, everything shifts. The why creates a demand, and the how becomes the method to meet that demand. So now your method is no longer flowing from identity, it's reacting to the pressure of the why. It's the counterfeit flow. You use your method to secure something, you pursue outcomes to stabilize yourself, and over time, you construct an identity from what you produce. So now your how, what we just defined, your pace, your decisions, your process, your tone, your leadership, it's all still operating in this counterfeit system, but it's been driven by the wrong source. And that's why the counterfeit sequence is reactive and unstable. And the kingdom sequence is ordered and stable because in one, the how is flowing from identity, in the other, the how is trying to create it. The difference is not subtle, it is foundational. And that's what we have been talking about this entire module. There is a clear distinction and a very important point that just can't be missed. So let me make sure that I state it clearly because the how is truly not just about how you get things done, how you achieve, how you get what you want. It is about what is being formed in you while you pursue the things that you want, that you desire, and that you need. So we have to locate this within the correct flow, right? That you've been taught throughout this module and that we've already touched on. And this is about how identity impacts your being, your nature, your essence, and what comes from your being is what is being produced, your values, your virtues, your personality traits, and from that, right, that dictates your doing, how you do things, and how you do things will lead to the type of outcomes and results that you get, the fruit. Formation is what is happening to your being as you move through this process. So your being, right? It it's not locked in. It continues to be shaped. So the how, it doesn't just influence the fruit, it shapes your being. How you do things, it's going to reinforce your thought patterns. It's going to strengthen or weaken your emotional stability. It's going to condition your heart posture and it trains your responses. If the how only affected results, maybe perhaps we could justify a corrupted process by pointing at a good outcome. But because the how is shaping your being, who you're becoming, you can achieve a desired outcome and still be internally misaligned. And that misalignment, as you go through this process over and over again, well, the misalignment is going to expand. It's going to reinforce distorted thought patterns. It's going to strengthen unhealthy emotional responses, and it's going to condition your heart posture more and more towards control, fear, and self reliance. So, what might start as a small misalignment becomes a way of being. And over time, that way of being becomes harder to recognize and even harder to change. So, that is the true cost of an unchecked method. This is why this turns this conversation about the how into a conversation about identity and authority. And it's not about tactics and strategy because your method, it's not just producing something, it's becoming part of forming who you are. So now we're going to move into section 3 to expose the distortion of this truth because it does run rampant in our culture. We just established that your how is part of your formation process. Your method is shaping your being. Yet, we live in a culture that completely ignores that how you do things is part of who you are becoming, which frankly makes sense because if the enemy can easily distort this aspect of our becoming, he makes his work really easy for himself. So let's go ahead in section 2 and expose the distortion. These statements on the slide, they're rarely said out loud, but they are lived every day. We live in a culture that evaluates legitimacy by results. If the numbers grow, it must be right. If the family looks good, it must be stable. If the business scales, it must be doing good work. We have normalized the belief that outcomes validate process. Speed is admired, intensity is applauded, control, it's mistaken for strength. And when results appear positive, we stop asking questions about the method. And this is how distortion hides. Because if something works, we assume it is justified. But the assumption collapses everything we just built. Because if the how is shaping your being, then working, it's not the standard. Faithfulness is, alignment is, and authority is. And we've already addressed this in the Who Owns the Why. We established that when identity is not anchored in God, motivation becomes distorted. The why begins to demand what identity is supposed to provide. Now we see the continuation of that same inversion. When the why is distorted, the how follows it. So instead of obedience, we get control. Instead of alignment, we get performance. And instead of trust, we get self preservation. Culture doesn't just ignore the order, it reinforces the inversion. It trains people to validate their methods by outcome instead of aligning their methods with authority. Once outcomes replace identity as the standard, these patterns you see on the slide become normalized. Hustle is praised as discipline, exhaustion becomes proof of importance. Anxiety is reframed as high standards, perfectionism is called excellence. Manipulation is justified because the mission matters. Pressure is excused because results are necessary. Visibility becomes more important than integrity, and perception begins to matter more than reality. These are not random behaviors, they are the natural expression of an inverted system. And when the why is demanding what identity is supposed to provide, the how is going to attempt to secure it. That's why these patterns feel necessary. That's why they feel justified. That's why they're so difficult to challenge in our society, because the inverted system is the worldly system and the inverted system works. And this leads us, though, to the next issue. Counterfeit methods are identity protection mechanism. And the real issue is that we have normalized identity protection in society. When identity is unstable, control becomes the strategy, and the how becomes the way we try to protect and secure it. So we hustle, we grind, we strive, we overextend ourselves, we live in urgency. This is the how, trying to secure worth through effort. We try to be perfect, we overplan, we do nothing until it feels safe. This is the how, protecting identity by avoiding risk. We compare and then we follow what other people are doing. We follow trends. We replicate others. This is the how, borrowing identity instead of flowing from it. We people please. We say yes to preserve acceptance. We avoid necessary tension. We soften truths to maintain connection. This is the how, managing relationships for security instead of leading a relationship from identity. We take shortcuts. We cut corners. We use people. We justify whatever it takes. This is the how, forcing outcomes instead of trusting the process. We avoid. We delay decisions. We stay silent when truth is required. We retreat to control our safety. This is the how, doing the same thing as in every other case. It is protecting, it is controlling, and it's trying to secure identity. Every one of these is revealing something. They are all attempts to secure identity through self-protection and control. They may produce outcomes, but they cannot produce peace. And this is what the enemy has normalized and wants us to continue to live in. Behind every distorted method is fear. The enemy has been sowing fear for a long time, and he's normalized fear and he's made fear part of living life. The fear of losing our place in life, the fear of being overlooked, the fear of rejection, the fear of falling behind, the fear of being exposed, the fear of not being enough, the fear of missing out, And that is a short list, but so many fears are needed to keep the distortion going. Exposing the distortion is seeing that the issue doesn't actually start with the method, it starts with the source. Because the same method can either flow from fear or from trust in God. And if you don't distinguish the source, you will misinterpret the method. So let's take a look at the contrast between the sources. So now in section 3, let's go ahead and let's contrast the sources, because this is not a conversation about good methods versus bad methods. It's not even a conversation about hustle versus rest, or excellence versus laziness, or ambition versus passivity. This is about authority. The question is not whether you are intense or calm. The question is who is directing your method, because the same behavior can flow from two different sources. Hard work can flow from fear, or it can flow from obedience. Silence can flow from avoidance, or it can flow from wisdom. Generosity can flow from image management, or it can flow from surrender. So we're not comparing behavior or even the methods, we are contrasting the sources. Self directed how versus God directed how. We've already seen that the counterfeit how is rooted in fear. This is what has been normalized. This is what many of us have experienced. The self directed how carries pressure. We live under an underlying message. It's on me. If I don't push, it won't happen. If I don't manage, it will fall apart. If I don't perform, I won't matter. So we force outcomes. We justify whatever it takes. We manipulate to stay ahead, not because we want to, but because it feels necessary. Hurry becomes normal. Pressure becomes expected. Comparison becomes a way of navigating. Control becomes the path to maintaining stability. Burnout doesn't feel like a warning. It feels like the cost of staying relevant, the cost of keeping up, the cost of holding everything together. Even when outcomes are achieved, the internal atmosphere is still pressure. And that pressure is revealing everything. It reveals that the method is being driven, it's being sourced by the self, that the responsibility has been internalized, that the weight is being carried in a way you're never designed to carry it. This is not strength, it's assumed responsibility. It's the belief that you must secure what only God can sustain. The God directed how is different. It's rooted in trusting God. The internal message is it's through me, not from me. Obedience becomes the priority. Integrity matters more than visibility, and pace is governed by wisdom. There might still be intensity, but it's healthy and joyful. There might still be a need for growth, but it's not frantic. There, there might still be a need for effort, but it's not out of having to prove yourself. There's a confidence that you're aligned even when the outcomes seem uncertain, a freedom from all of the striving, a quiet clarity that you're acting in obedience, not in reaction. There's a peace that becomes this internal indicator that has nothing to do with circumstances or the absence of responsibility. Instead, it's this settled steadiness, even under pressure. It's the kind of peace that does not remove intensity, it removes the panic. It does not remove effort, it removes the proving. This is the difference between carrying weight and being carried while you work, because surrender replaces control. In my experience, this is where many people struggle. They recognize that there's something wrong, And they recognize that what's been normalized, it just isn't right, but they don't know what right looks like. So I want to go through the list that we've gone through before. I want to explain what that looks like in the kingdom. So, where the world hustles to prove, the kingdom stewards what has been given. You still work, but you're not striving to become someone. You're stewarding who you already are. Where the world is trying to be perfect in order to control, the kingdom executes in trust. You move when you're led by God to do so, not when everything feels safe. It's actually usually the opposite, and you're willing to be seen in the process, no matter how messy it looks, because you're executing in trust, no matter what it looks like in the process. Where the world compares to find direction, the kingdom aligns with assignment. You build what you're called to build, not what is trending or what's visible to others or what others are doing. Where the world people pleases to maintain approval, the kingdom moves with conviction. You speak the truth, you set boundaries, and you lead with clarity, not to control, but because you're anchored with God. Where the world takes shortcuts to accelerate outcomes, the kingdom honors process. You refuse to compromise. You trust that the process is about formation and character development. You build what can be sustained. Where the world avoids things, right, to stay safe, the kingdom moves in courageous obedience. You step forward when instructed to by God, no matter what's at risk. You engage when necessary, and you do act when there is risk. These are major differences. The method is completely different, and these methods reveal that God is the source. This is the dividing line. The counterfeit how demands that you carry outcomes. It demands that you secure identity. It demands that you control perception. It demands that you protect yourself. But you're never designed to carry any of that weight. The kingdom how requires surrender. You obey, you act, you move, you build, but you do not carry the result. When you stop carrying what only God can carry, the pressure lifts. The method becomes lighter, the soul becomes steadier, and something most people have never experienced begins to emerge: freedom. Not freedom from responsibility, but freedom from fear, freedom from self preservation, freedom from proving, freedom from constant internal negotiation of whether you are enough. And with that freedom comes joy, not hype, not emotional excitement, but deep, durable joy. The joy of alignment, the joy of obedience, the joy of knowing that your identity is not hanging on the outcome. Most people have never experienced that kind of joy because they've never stopped carrying what's not theirs to carry. But here's the challenge: even when you see this clearly, you can still drift back into fear and control because the enemy is trying to drive you back there. You can still default back to old methods. You can still respond from pressure instead of surrender. So the next question then becomes, how do you stay aligned? How do you recognize when your method is shifting back into self direction? And how do you evaluate the how in real time? And this is where we need structure, not tactics, but principles. Now, in section 4, we are going to talk about governing principles, because once you understand the difference between counterfeit how and kingdom how, the next challenge is maintaining alignment, not once or twice, but consistently, in real time, under pressure, or any type of conditions. Without structure, you're likely to drift. You will default back to urgency, back to control, and back to self-preservation. Not because you want to, but because it's familiar. Now, these governing principles right here exist to interrupt that drift. They do not tell you what decisions to make, but they do tell you how to evaluate the source of your decision. But I got to be clear about something, very clear about this. These are only possible through relationship with God, and they're only possible when your mind is being renewed by the Word of God. That means that you're reading your Bible, you're studying it, you're meditating on it, and you're living it out. Because apart from that, what I'm about to describe is either going to feel impossible and you're not going to even entertain it, so you're going to give up on it, or you're going to try to reduce it to behavior management. And this is so not about behavior modification. This is about transformation through alignment with God. These governing principles, they're going to help you discern, am I acting from surrender or am I reacting from fear? Am I aligned with God's authority or am I carrying something that was never mine to carry? If the who directs the how, these principles protect alignment. They keep your method clean and they keep your posture anchored in God. And they keep your being from drifting back into inversion and distortion. The authority principle exposes everything. This is what we've been covering in this class. Your method reveals the authority over your life. If you believe the outcome depends on you, your method is going to carry a lot of pressure driven by fear with a need to control. When you truly believe that God is responsible for the outcome, the method are going to change and you're going to let God carry the weight. Now, not carrying the weight doesn't mean that you're disengaged or that you don't care. It means that you start exercising trust and patience. It means faith expressed through obedience. It means waiting when waiting is required. And this is the kind of waiting that's not passive delay or a spiritual form of inaction. It's actually a confident endurance, an active posture of trust. It means binding yourself to the promise of God and looking toward what He has promised with hope. This is not wishful thinking, but a grounded knowing, a guaranteed hope rooted in who God is, which is why it's so important to be in relationship with Him and knowing who He is by reading His Word. When God carries the outcome, you are free to focus on faithfulness, on doing what God is asking you to do and leaving the rest up to Him. We can't force good fruit. We can't produce good fruit. We have to trust that God produces good fruit. The good fruit belongs to God. This is what it means to surrender control. And this is not weakness, trust me, because initially surrendering to God, it's hard, it's difficult because it is counter to what we've been taught in the world. And this is what we must do because that is alignment with authority. And alignment produces everything that we're looking for, that our soul really truly wants and desires. The counterfeit, the worldly way, self-derived way, wants fruit immediately, wants outcomes and results because that helps to stabilize identity. But the formation principle teaches us that the kingdom prioritizes formation. If God is building character, He will not shortcut the process to give you results and outcome. If you're being impatient with the process, then you're likely protecting identity through results. The formation of your being always precedes sustainable good fruit. The integrity principle exposes shortcut logic because you cannot manipulate to build trust. You cannot exaggerate to build credibility. You cannot pressure to build loyalty. You cannot neglect your family to build a healthy legacy. You cannot ignore character and expect stability. If integrity is compromised in the how, the fruit is going to carry the fracture. The lie is that you must bend the rules, cut corners, or manipulate people in order to make the assignment succeed. It forces you to choose between your calling and your character. But the truth is, if a method requires you to violate your integrity, that method is not from the source of the assignment. It's not from God. The assignment is a trust, integrity is a defense. The two are not in conflict. God will never require you to become corrupt in the process of fulfilling what He has called you to do. Pace and timing are not the same. Pace is how fast you move, timing is whether you should be moving at all. Urgency often pushes speed, the pace of things, and impatience ignores timing. Wisdom, thankfully, discerns both. Now, the counterfeit how is reactive. It moves fast because it's afraid to miss out. It moves prematurely because it fears irrelevance. But sometimes the distortion can also be the opposite. Delay can be fear, avoidance can masquerade as patience. That's why wisdom must govern both pace and timing. The kingdom how is not rush, but it's also not passive. It moves when instructed, it waits when required. And we've already covered that it waits with confidence. Wisdom governs pace and wisdom discerns timing. Let's look at wisdom at work, what it looks like. In leadership, wisdom may say, this is the right vision, but not yet. In business, wisdom may say, growth is good, but premature expansion creates fragility. In parenting, wisdom may say, correction is necessary, but timing determines whether it forms or fractures the child. In marriage, wisdom may say the conversation must happen, but not in this emotional state. In spiritual life, wisdom may say this door is open, but it's not your assignment. Wisdom is what keeps your method aligned so that you don't move ahead of God or fall behind in fear. The peace indicator. There's no real peace, sound mind, or completeness to be found in the counterfeit how. It may produce results and recognition, and it might even produce temporary relief, but it cannot produce peace. And this kind of peace, it can't be manufactured. It doesn't come from removing pressure. It doesn't come from taking a vacation. It doesn't come from reducing responsibility. Peace is not circumstantial management. In the Old Testament, the word shalom implies completeness, soundness, and total well being in life. It speaks of wholeness, integrity of the soul, nothing fractured, nothing divided. Peace does not mean ease, it means internal alignment. You may still feel resistance, you may still face difficulty, and you may still feel stretch, but you will not feel internally torn. You will not feel frantic. You will not feel the constant pressure of proving yourself. The right how may be demanding, but it will not feel like a burden on your soul. Peace is the indicator that surrender, not fear, is directing the method. If your method consistently produces anxiety, strain, and internal fragmentation, then it's worth asking who is directing it, because peace cannot coexist with self preservation, and shalom cannot grow where control is reigning. The alignment test is a practical filter. If the method requires you to compromise your integrity, silence your convictions, ignore your boundaries, exhaust your soul, neglect the formation of your character, or is asking you to manipulate outcomes, then It is not aligned with God. It's not aligned with who you were created to be and designed to become. The kingdom how will stretch and challenge you, but it will not deform or corrupt you. We have reached the point of conclusion. And at this point, a conclusion should be unavoidable. Methods are not neutral. You're not simply choosing techniques. You are revealing trust. You are revealing allegiance. You are revealing who you believe is responsible for the outcome. Every time you rush, every time you control, every time you manipulate, every time you avoid, you are declaring something about authority. And every time you obey, every time you wait, every time you act with integrity, every time you surrender control, you are declaring something. This class was never about improving your approach. It was about exposing your source because the how is where belief becomes visible. This is the decision, not whether you will act, because you will act, not whether you will pursue something, because you will pursue things. The decision is who directs your method. Is your approach driven by fear, by insecurity, by urgency, by performance, or is it directed by surrender, by obedience, by trust, by alignment? You cannot have peace while carrying what was never yours to carry. You cannot have shalom while operating from control. At some point, you must decide who carries the outcome. This is it, the final slide of this class and of the module. So I want to end with the final anchor that when God is the source of your identity, everything changes. None of it starts with what you do, it starts with who you are. The who is greater than the what. When God defines your who, your identity is no longer something you have to build, you have to prove, you have to protect, or you have to defend. It is something that you receive from God. And because it is received, it becomes stable. When your who is anchored in God, your why begins to align. You're no longer driven by fear, and you're no longer trying to secure who you are. Your motives become clean. When your why is aligned, your how is no longer reactive, it's directed. You move with clarity, you act with trust, and you follow instead of forcing. When your how is directed, your what produces fruit, not just results, fruit, something that carries life, something that lasts, something that reflects the source it came from. So the difference is not just outcomes, it's the entire flow. When the source is right, when your identity is sourced from God, everything downstream comes into alignment.